Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Iowa City Book Festival. My name is John Kenyon and I am the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization that is presenting this year's festival, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Before we begin our program, I would like to take the opportunity to thank our festival sponsors. The festival is supported by the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, and Iowa Public Radio. Today's event will be moderated by Christopher Merrill, who's the director of the University of Iowa's International Writing Program. Chris is the author of several collections of poetry, including Watchfire, for which he received the Lavin Younger Poets Award from the Academy of American Poets, as well as many edited volumes and translations. He's also the author of 6 books of nonfiction, among them Only the Nails Remain, Scenes from the Balkan Wars, and Self-Portrait with Dogwood. His latest book is Flares, a collection of prose poems. And now I would like to turn everything over to Chris.
Thank you, John. It's great. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the Iowa City Book Festival my dear friend, Fiona Sampson, who comes to us today through the magic of Zoom from her rural home on the Welsh border. Fiona is the author of nearly 30 books of poetry and prose, which have been translated into nearly 40 languages. And what her work reveals at every turn is a musical intelligence matched by a ferocious intellect, which is ever curious about the human condition. Thus, she has written natural history, 8 prize-winning books of poetry, a biography of Mary Shelley, a study of the poetic imagination and musical forms. She was a concert violinist before she became a full-time writer, and much more, for which she has been richly honored. Now she has published an astonishing biography of the 19th century poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which offers a revision of a poet we think we know, but who turns out to be altogether more interesting and contemporary feeling than we might have imagined. She was, if you will, the rock star of 19th century English poetry, someone we might think of in terms of, let's say, Walt Whitman on this side of the Atlantic. And it is Fiona's genius to bring her to life in ways that make her our friend and inspiration. Please join me in welcoming Fiona Sampson.
Gosh, thank you, Christopher, for such a generous introduction, and coming from you, it means all the more. And thank you very much to the Iowa City of Literature and to Prairie Lights for hosting me. It's great to be with you in the ways in which I'm with you. So yes, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, that sort of strange quasi-fictional character who is also Britain's most distinguished still woman poet, who is voted by us our nation's favorite poet, largely on the basis of How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways, that late poem from the sonnet sequence, Sonnets from the Portuguese, and yet who has been traduced in a sense by the popular, very popular culture that's carried her name forward as the archetype of the swooning 19th century lady poetess whose work is of no value, whose private life is significant, and who serves in a sense, certainly in British culture, as a kind of double cipher to avoid the perhaps tiresome task of reading poetry. There's a kind of the feminine diminutive, a poetess, and there is a sense of poetry itself as not a living force for social change and individual insight, but as something decorative, miniaturized, and of the boudoir. Naturally, as a woman poet myself, as a British woman poet, I have a different relationship with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. For me, she is a figure of great significance. I mean, she's a different kind of cipher. She represents the woman's voice in all those anthologies from my school days. And therefore, even just her name was always very important to me from when I was sort of 6 years old. And of course, therefore, I wanted to reclaim her, because clearly it can't both be the case that someone produced such an extraordinary volume of literary work, which, as something we'll talk about, did change the course of writing in English, both in Britain and on your side of the Atlantic in North America, and which was greatly admired, and be an ineffectual fictional character who is of no relevance. And since the work is there, I started with the work and tried to use it to trace my way back to the person who wrote it. Because I think that perhaps one way to think about biography, a form about which I am ambivalent, because I think it's, apart from anything else, an unequal relationship with our subject, is its starting point has to be why that individual is significant. Now, they might be just significant because they are a representative of their era. But when there is work, it seems to me that why we care about Elizabeth Barrett Browning is not because she fell ill. Lots of women in the 19th century, and men, and in other centuries, have fallen ill, but because of what she did despite that. So when I came to start work on her, I was astonished to find there hadn't been a biography since 1988, a full-length literary biography. That was a wonderful one by Margaret Forster, the novelist and great nonfiction writer. But at the time that she was writing the biography, the fabulous Browning Correspondence Archive had not yet got further than, in effect, Elizabeth's juvenilia. And so the whole of the period of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's creative maturity, all those letters, those other correspondence from that era were not available to Margaret Forster. So her very touching and feelingful biography, which is called Elizabeth Barrett Browning, is very much an examination of the emerging sensibility of a young woman in her family. I wanted to compliment that. And rather than sort of talk more generally, I think I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the introduction to Two-Way Mirror. And the reason I'm going to do that sort of straight away, launch into that, is that in a sense it's my elevator pitch for the book. But more than that, it's the passage where I was trying to recoup the start of the image making that produced, or we could say went wrong for, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, great poet, born in 1806, so born halfway virtually between Mary Shelley, who was born 9 years older, and Charlotte Bronte, who was born 10 years later. So I'm going to read from the book. In my favourite portrait of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she simultaneously turns away and looks back over her shoulder at us. Of course, in one sense, every historical figure does this, glancing over their shoulder towards the future where we're watching them, even while they face away from us into their own time. But Barrett Browning makes the gesture particularly provocative. Her wide, sensual mouth dips and rises in a curly bracket. Sceptical, even teasing, her gaze has a directness that seems startlingly modern, which is an irony, since it's an image that has been constructed by thoroughly old-fashioned means. The frontispiece for the fourth British edition of her best-selling verse novel, Aurora Leigh, is an engraving after an ambrotype taken specifically for this purpose. On the afternoon in September 1858, when a shutter falls on the poet's half-smile in a stuffy studio on Le Havre harbourfront, photography is understood to be neither artistic nor detailed enough for portraiture. It will be another half dozen years before Julia Margaret Cameron starts to produce her famous, markedly pre-Raphaelite images of friends and family. And so the portrait that eventually results from this sitting won't be created by the photographer, but by a founder member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood itself. But his are not to be the only hands her image passes through. First, it's engraved by a less stellar craftsman, Thomas Oldham Barlow. The artist edits the result, quotes, "The hair brought a little more down over the forehead, and the parting line not left quite so raw, more tone on the forehead, and indeed all over the face. The mouth is considerably in need of correction by adding a line of shadow all along the top of the upper lip, thus lessening the curve upward at the corners, or as we would call it, a smile. Notes and sketches sprawl over Rossetti's offprint from the engraver's block. He wants his engraver to be more faithful to the photograph portrait they're both working from. For example, by removing that sort of smile not in the photograph and not characteristic of the original. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's had plenty of chances to study this original at the Brownings' home, which he calls an evening resort where I never feel unhappy. In the 2 years since the hugely successful appearance of Aurora Leigh, Elizabeth's pioneering 9-book Bildungsroman, which is the first to tell the story of a woman becoming a writer. So in effect, not just the first Bildungsroman by a woman about a woman, but the first Künstlerroman, the story of becoming a maker by a woman about a woman. Rossetti's initial impressions, which are as unattractive a person as can well be imagined, she looks quite worn out with illness and speaks in the tone of an invalid, have turned to admiring protectiveness. Now, he replaces the photographer's stock studio furniture with a symbolic writing desk and instructs Barlow to darken the subject's hair and enlarge her signature dark eyes to make her look a little younger and less worn out. After all, this portrait's whole purpose is to extinguish what her husband calls certain horrible libels on humanity, published as portraits of her in America. Portrayals all too similar to Rossetti's own first impressions. In the 21st century, we recognize instantly the Brownings' anxiety about this key publicity shot and their need to control the image of the international celebrity that 52-year-old Elizabeth Barrett Browning has become. The irony is that despite being so anxiously aware of the ramifications of image making, she is destined to become a notorious object lesson in how distorted ideas about famous individuals get established. The Brownings would have been astonished and mortified to see myths about their private life obscure first her work and eventually even her identity. Let's remind ourselves that Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a pivotal figure, changing the direction of English language poetry and influencing both her contemporaries and subsequent generations of poets and readers. In her lifetime, acknowledged as Britain's greatest ever woman poet, she receives international critical acclaim and attracts a huge readership. Yet, within 70 years of her death, popular culture will have reduced this figure who, when she died, was mourned as a public political heroine in revolutionary Italy, to a swooning poetess, in whose little couch-bound life only a tyrannical father and an ardent poet-lover contribute to drama. The damage will be done above all by Rudolph Bézier, author of The Barretts of Wimpole Street. 3 film versions follow his 1931 Broadway hit of this domestic melodrama. A Norma Shearer and Charles Laughton vehicle in 1934, 1957's remake with Jennifer Jones and John Gielgud, and the 1982 TV movie with Jane Lapotaire and Joss Ackland. There were also no fewer than 7 further remakes for TV. There's also, incidentally, a musical, which I think is the campest of travesties, which includes numbers including I Want to Be Well and, worst of all, Pass the Eau de Cologne. By the 1970s, when Saul Bellow, Philip Roth and John Updike crowd the book charts, the roaring boys of North American literary criticism will go a stage further, maligning Elizabeth Barrett Browning as relevant to the history of literature only through marriage, or worse, as hindering that real writer, her husband, Robert Browning. In 1973's Oxford Anthology of English Literature, which actually I can see on screen just over my right shoulder, Lionel Trilling and Harold Bloom pronounce, I quote, Miss Barrett became an invalid for still mysterious reasons from 1838 to 1846, when she eloped with the best poet of the age. Her long poem, Aurora Leigh, 1856, was much admired even by Ruskin, but is very bad. Quite bad, too, are the famous sonnets from the Portuguese. Though the Brownings' married life was reasonably happy, Mrs. Browning's enthusiasms gave her husband much grief. Of course, the tendentiousness of this is striking, but then the anthology's editors print just one minor poem by Elizabeth alongside, in 4,500 pages, one minor poem each by Edith Sitwell and Stevie Smith, two by Emily Bronte, and passages from Dorothy Wordsworth's journal, in total fewer than 24 pages. This kind of literary revisionism is strenuous stuff, excluding all of the Bronte novels, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, can be neither innocent nor accidental. And it illustrates vividly how literary canons are not born, but made. It also illustrates Elizabeth's role as a bellwether for the fate of women writers' literary reputations. And Virginia Woolf, who is herself excluded from that anthology, contributed, in a sense, her own two penneth of disparagement. She went to see the Rudolph Gautier play, and the same year in The Common Reader, she summed up Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, quotes, "Passionate lovers in curls and side whiskers, oppressed, defiant, eloping. In this guise, thousands of people must know and love the Brownings who have never read a line of their poetry. But fate has not been kind to Mrs. Browning as a writer. Nobody reads her, nobody discusses her, nobody troubles to put her in her place." And we can't forget that Virginia Woolf herself published Flush, a biography, which is a biography of Barrett Browning, told from the point of view of her pet spaniel. It's a beautiful book, especially if you're a dog lover like me, but it's not a dignified rendering of literary accounts. And so I keep repeating that Elizabeth's contribution to literary history is distinctive. So perhaps let's just sort of talk about that a little bit. I mean, among the poets, the writers who admired her is not only John Ruskin, but Oscar Wilde, Rudyard Kipling, Carlyle. And in North America, she was friendly with the group who were publishing Melville and Hawthorne and the movement that would become Young America. Also, very famously, she was much admired by Emily Dickinson, who wrote several poems on her death and who had that Rossetti portrait about which I was talking, that engraving up on the wall of her room. So why was she so influential? Well, I've just talked about Aurora Leigh's subject matter, that sense of taking on the Bildungsroman, that really significant form which had really come to the fore in the Romantic era as a very serious way to examine the human condition, you know, how a self becomes, the veil of soul making, as it were. The sonnets from the Portuguese, sonnets are not an original form, and nor was Elizabeth the first woman to write sonnets, but they are confessional sonnets of desire, of romantic desire, written in secret, even kept secret, even from Robert, during her courtship by Robert, in which she does adopt the lyric first personal I of, you know, the love declarations of the sonnet. And that is sort of the equivalent in poetry terms of the male gaze in visual art. She's taking on the standpoint of the ardent lover. She's also a poet who wrote on significant political causes. She was in adulthood an ardent abolitionist. She was also passionate about the cause of Italian republicanism, democracy, independence from Habsburg Empire, Habsburg rule. She wrote The Cry of the Children, which is a poem calling for the abolition of child labour. And one of the subplots of Aurora Leigh is about the trafficking of women, actually impoverished women whose families have been thrown off, have lost their livelihoods in the agricultural revolution, which transformed the British landscape, primarily the English, but the British landscape, and sent the common people, the peasantry, off the land before it happened in the rest of Europe or elsewhere in the world, and sent those people into the cities as cheap labor for the Industrial Revolution. So Elizabeth writes about rape and trafficking of women as abhorrent, which seems to us a no-brainer, but at the time, the discourse was all around fallen women, that the woman who was prostituted was the person to be condemned rather than the person who trafficked or used the prostitute. So really quite revolutionary in social terms. And the reason that, in a sense, Elizabeth was able to be so influential was she was, as Chris has said, a sort of rock star. And she was a rock star because she was addressing the new mass audience that arose in the Victorian era as education in Britain became first much more widely available through various charitable enterprises, the ragged schools in which her family were involved, and then became eventually, through a series of Acts of Parliament, compulsory up to the age of 11. So mass literacy began to emerge. And there was also, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the end of subsistence farming as the basic, means of survival for most people in Britain, the residue of the old feudal system, there was beginning to be a clerking class, there was beginning to be a white collar, emerging middle class who had just enough leisure for the great leisure activity of the time, which was reading aloud by the family hearth. And Elizabeth was peculiarly well suited. Her sensibility and her sense of her political sensibility, although a little bit progressive, was really quite in tune with the as it were, the heart of the hearth and home of Middle England, as we would say today. She was she came from a privileged background, something we'll talk about in a minute, and she was, unlike the Romantics, she wasn't consciously a radical wanting to be out ahead of social consensus. She wanted to be part of social consensus, address it, shift it a little bit. And of course, she had all the more influence actually on what everyday, ordinary people were thinking, because she was addressing from that relatively conservative standpoint. She also, because she was wealthy, and because once she'd married Robert Browning, they went to live in Italy when she was 40, she was living abroad. She was sort of safe in several ways from social condemnation. And so she always published under her own name, unlike her famous peers. If we think of the Bronte sisters, who were publishing pseudonymously as the Bell brothers, Jane Austen publishes anonymously as a lady, Mary Shelley anonymously as the author of Frankenstein. You have Marianne Evans as George Eliot. So most women, not all, but many women were hiding their female identities or their identities. And in a sense, by putting her own name to her work, Elizabeth made herself not into personality in a kind of celebrity obsessed way, but she increased the leverage of her name, her kind of personal address, personal to a mass audience through this new mass readership at a time when poetry, of course, is seen as the highest literary form, the most interesting, the most widely reviewed, and still has a mass audience. The other way in which, so thematically, Elizabeth is very influential in literary terms. This is what literature can do. She's emerging at the same time as Charles Dickens. He was younger, but he emerged at a younger age. We know the impact his novels had on public perceptions of poverty and so on. Elizabeth is doing it in poetry. But she also shifted the diction of verse in English. She was very much a modernizer, which is something that seems counterintuitive perhaps today, because we have such a strong sense of her as very much a Victorian, but actually it's she and Tennyson, again, a little younger, but again, they're emerging absolutely in parallel, really, in professional terms, shifted British poetry in English, and then she was publishing a lot in North America too, from kind of capitalized abstract nouns and quite philosophical verse often. I mean, I'm a romantic, I love romantic poetry, but to narrative, intimate, often poetry with a moral burden, poetry whose diction is a little subversive. She's quite the mistress of cheeky rhymes. And so there's a kind of new informality, a kind of domesticity and informality and narrative element that comes into her poetry, and which is actually, and it's very feelingful, very full of sentiment, but sentiment in the original sense of feeling. And that's the poetics, that the modern poetics of her era. And Robert learned from her. Robert was her junior. He was 6 years younger than her. When they were together while she was alive, he was far the less distinguished poet. He'd published less. He'd been an enfant terrible, and then his work was seen to have gone off the boil, whereas Elizabeth's reputation had grown and grown. So he was sort of flying on her coattails. And although, you know, obviously a book like Men and Women is astonishing, the poetics are not developed by Robert with Elizabeth imitating, they are developed by Elizabeth with Robert learning from her. So that's a long paragraph for me, and I see that we're really racing through the time. So I'm going to read a little bit of the scene setting of the book, because it sets the scene also for Elizabeth's cultural background, and then I'll read one other passage before we talk. This is the beginning of chapter 1. Sun beats down on a shoulder of parkland. Parched grass crackles underfoot. Blowflies and mosquitoes hover among odours of meadowsweet and wild hop. The steep hillside is covered with drying hay that catches the ankles, but at the crest you feel on top of the world. Turn north, and almost at your feet is a steep cut running east towards the Malvern Hills. Turn south, and a dramatic natural amphitheatre commands the Hereford Plain. Two strikingly different worlds fit together here along a single geological theme. In one direction, stylish villas, a sign of Malvern's emerging fashionability, dot the wooded slopes of Colwall. In the other, a rural hinterland reaches south and west to the border of Wales. What are the very first things we remember? Bursts of light and colour, perhaps, with the luminous quality of glass. Moments that remain as images, if not complete stories. For a 4-year-old called Bar, this is her first summer in the dazzlingly fertile Herefordshire countryside. Her previous homes in County Durham and then near London can already be little more than trace impressions. Here, everything is hyperreal. Footpaths disappear into thickets. Nettles taller than a man spill across the fields. Even the hot, stormy weather is exceptional. It's headier still down in the closed-off valleys known locally as Hopes. Barr's family have recently settled in one of these ripples of land, as she will call it in Aurora Lee, where the outside world disappears. But from Oyster Hill, this high point of their estate, quotes, commanding the romantic scenery of the Malvern and adjoining hills with views highly interesting and of great extent, everything in the vicinity can be surveyed just as it is designed to be. In 1810, British wealth still broadly correlates with landowning. If anything, landed gentry have tightened hold on their estates in recent decades as the paralegal process of enclosure abolishes the common land on which tenants used to support themselves. The old subsistence farming strips are being replaced by money made visible as ornamental parks and newly managed fields tied up fast with hedges, nosegay-like, also from Aurora Lee. The agricultural revolution has transformed land, for those who own it, from a reliable but rather unexciting asset into a fashionable and briskly profitable gentleman's hobby. Unlanded money finds itself in something of a hurry to join the action, and Barr's father is no exception. His wealth is prodigious, but it's been generated by international trade and is held largely offshore. The precisely calibrated English class system will be only too happy to point this out to him as inferiority. What's more, he was born abroad in Jamaica, so this Herefordshire estate called Hope End is the first British property he's owned. He bought nearly 500 acres with a big house, farm buildings and cottages, quotes, to make yourself, brother and sister and dear mamma happy, as he tells Barr. It sounds like a fairy tale, and in a way it is, though as in every fairy tale, not everything's quite as it appears. Easy money, dirty money. Beyond the peaceful Herefordshire hills, vales, woods netted in a silver mist that sequester Barr and her parents, on the other side of the Atlantic lies another very different set of estates. At his death, 8 years from now, her maternal grandfather, John Graham Clark, will have interest in at least 13 Jamaican sugar plantations, where he holds enslaved more than 600 men and women and their children. Her father, too, inherited Jamaican plantations. And the Barretts seem to believe themselves to be of mixed heritage. Percy Barrett, Barr's 4 times great-grandfather, arrived in Jamaica in 1655, an officer in the army that captured it from Spain. As a reward, King Charles II granted him land, a colonist then, but not yet a slaver. Subsequent generations, however, changed this, and the intervening century and a half has been plenty long enough for the kinds of consensual and non-consensual relationships across ethnic divides, both acknowledged and otherwise, that produce mixed heritage populations in long colonized societies. When she's nearly 40, Barr will write to her lover that she herself has what she calls the blood of a slave. Quotes, "I would give 10 towns in Norfolk, if I had them, to own some purer lineage than that of the blood of the slave. Cursed are we from generation to generation." I seem to hear the commination service. It's a letter that's been much quoted, but clearly what she's talking about is the tragic destiny of being enslaved. If Barr then has already encountered difficulty in imagining herself into the role of a woman poet, imagining herself as a Black woman poet must be, for her time and class, almost unthinkable. The only precursor she might have heard of is Phyllis Wheatley, the African-born poet who was raised enslaved in Boston, Massachusetts, and created a sensation in 1773 when she moved to London and published a poetry collection, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, under the patronage of the Countess of Huntingdon. She is, in a way, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's alter ego, the kind of outlier and possibly best case chance Elizabeth might have had if she'd been born enslaved. Later admired for her classicism, in her own time, much of Wheatley's celebrity was based precisely on the perceived anomaly of her gifts. The exception is often viewed as an imposter, and the Barrett family disease will be imposter syndrome. So I'm not, of course, saying, well, I am not saying that Elizabeth did have mixed heritage. I really hope to find that, because she would have been such a fabulous early European Black woman poet, but it wasn't unreasonable of her to believe that she had Black heritage, because she had first cousins whose mothers had been born enslaved, who were brought over to Britain, actually, in some cases. So it really wasn't an unrealistic expectation. Of course, the other part of that is the slavery money. There is no getting around the fact that Elizabeth, and there was no getting around it for Elizabeth herself, that her entire upbringing, her entire life was possible because it was based on blood money. It was based on slavery money. And so it's perhaps no surprise that when she grew up, she did possibly the only thing she could have done, since to walk away from the family money would have been literally suicidal, because she would literally have been destitute on the street at a time when there was absolutely no kind of welfare of any kind, which was to campaign, to use her enormous clout as a writer to write not only several anti-slavery poems, including The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, which is still an incredible blood-curdling poem about the gratuitousness, the baroque, unnecessary, more than unnecessary nature, but the kind of barockery of the cruelty of enslavement, and so there's no papering over it at all. But she donated it to an abolitionist publication, the Liberty Bell in the States, and so that it could fundraise as well as raise consciousness. And it's an irony that her very first poem, when she's 6, is on the cruelty of forcement to men, which is about press ganging, the enslavement in a sense of young men and boys who were abducted by the Royal Navy from towns and cities in Britain and forced to be sailors for many years. So I'm just going to finish with not with a death scene, because I think that's well, it's very sad, and it's sad to be reading it in a time of COVID, but the title of my book is Two-Way Mirror, and I gave it that title because it seemed to me that Elizabeth's work is the mirror of her life, and it's a two-way mirror, like those mirrors in, I used to work in psychiatric hospitals where people are observed from behind the glass. It seems to me that Elizabeth's work works like a two-way mirror in a sense for us, because we as biographers and as readers observe her through her writing, but she can't observe us. And that seems to me to be something that's at the heart of portraiture of all kinds, visual and biographical, that in a sense it's a disrupted relationship in which, by a kind of cultural sleight of hand, we break off the kind of exchange that is encounter, we being the painter, or trying to be a biographer, at the last minute, and we slip into our shoes, the audience, the viewer, and that's not someone that our subject can see. Our subject has been committed by the portrait and can't answer back. That's a lot of complicated thinking, which I've just rather clumsily condensed. So there are frames, little short reflections on biography that add up. You could read all the frames as one short essay on biography. And this is the closing frame. Like Aurora Leigh, this biography is a portrait, not a self-portrait. But the imagination is greedy. As Elizabeth's readers, we respond to elements of her life we feel mirror our own. There's surely nothing wrong with such feelings. Let's call them recognition or complicity. It's how humans have always used stories. And biographies are, in the first place, stories, after all. Besides, how else can we encounter our biographical subject except by coming to meet her? Writing can never be wholly innocent of the writing self. And slowly I'm coming to accept that a biographer's own self always frames her subject. But Elizabeth's poetry too composes a kind of self-portrait, or rather mirror. As she became herself through her writing reflected that developing self. And so her body of work creates a kind of looking glass in which, dimly, we make out the person who wrote it, her choices and opinions, what moved her, habits and characteristic turns of phrase. Though this is true of all writers' work, it is especially true for Elizabeth, because poetry isn't, to paraphrase that early hero of hers, Byron, of her life a thing apart, but her whole existence. She makes a brilliant case study in writerly self-invention. in the self on the page. Besides, this is a self that overwhelmingly repays our attention. Barrett Browning shows us that the way into good, even great writing goes step by step, gradus ad parnassum. You could say that her story works like a practice mirror for writers, even today. 7 years after his wife's death, in his 4-volume verse novel, The Ring and the Book, Robert describes the literal mirror in which Elizabeth saw her own face daily, the one with, quotes, twin cherubs in the tarnished frame, which hung in the drawing room at Casa Guidi, tall to the ceiling top. Today, it hangs there once again, on the green wall above the red sofa, facing the windows, the balcony, and the side wall of San Felice, a shady view, which it reflects only incompletely. Visitors to the apartment see their own reflections pass to and fro in the glass. Perhaps some even fantasize that they glimpse Elizabeth there too. But we don't need to visit Florence or to believe in ghosts to encounter her. To read Elizabeth Barrett Browning is to witness how, unaware that she's being observed, she reflects herself in her poetry, which, with all its innovative brilliance, makes a fabulously ornate two-way mirror. Thank you.
Fiona, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Again, to the audience, if you want to put questions into either the Q&A or the chat, I'll be happy to raise them here. But first, I want to ask a couple questions, just maybe even formal questions. You read at the end from a frame. You adopted the 9 books of Aurora Leigh as the, let's say, the scaffolding for the book you write. So How Not to Love, How to Become Ill. You give us her history in a different way. What was your thinking about that? Apart from the fact, I think, on some level, wanting to highlight the real magnificence of Aurora Leigh.
Yes, thank you. Of course, what a great question. It's true, I did want to highlight Aurora Leigh. And I was also I was genuinely fascinated by the way that Aurora Leigh does function as an ars poetica. And although it's not an ordered roman à clé, it's not, I mean, clearly it's fiction, but it doesn't, the events in the verse novel do not mirror Elizabeth's life. But large parts of her life do reappear in it. For example, it's set in Herefordshire and it's set in Italy. And centrally, there is, and particularly in books 4 and 5, there are long passages which really appeal to the poetry geek in me. I mean, we're all, aren't we? Kind of poetry geeks, we poets. In which she talks about her ars poetica, what poetry's for, also how it might be. So she actually talks about technique, and she's very funny about critical reception, the kind of sexist critical reception. Says, oh, how astonishing. Nowadays, here are women competent to spell. And she even puts the ellipsis, competent to spell. And, it's so charming. And so I was really aware, I had a kind of intuition quite early on. There is a sense in which Aurora Leigh is a looking glass. It's not an autobiography, but it's something in which we can discern her. And so quite early on, I had this sense of, can we map it? And I felt like, yes, we can. As you said, in a sense, one can sort of summarize the burden of each book, as she calls the chapters of the verse novel. And those do map on to Elizabeth's life. And actually, also, I'm afraid, I did this with, writing about Mary Shelley too. I have this terrible tendency to, quite early on, and maybe it's a function of publishing too, isn't it? When you write your proposal, you have to give a sense of the structure of the book. So you do seize on, because at that stage you haven't really done the research, not the deep research, the deep dive. So you have to see, you tend to take a chronological, for a biography anyway, I find, you tend to take a chronological framework. And that rough outline often seems to be, indeed, that's right. Yes, it turns out this is the passage of her life, which hasn't been much talked about, which we can expand. And this is indeed the passage that shrinks. Or the chapters sort of, the eras shift slightly laterally and so on. But that sense of, I guess, I'm not very good at narrative. I like a sense of a freeze frame for each stage.
I have to say, I found it immensely attractive because you also choose to write in present tense, so it feels as if it's unfolding even as we read, not some part of the distant past. I'm intrigued that you describe the interludes or frames as a kind of miniature essay in biography. And in the first one, if I'm remembering, Italo Calvino appears, and
Yes.
and you raise one of my favorite novels of all, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, as another way to think about biography. Can you say a little bit more about the role of the frames in this book?
Yes, thank you. Actually, what happened was, I had the Aurora structure and I had nearly finished the book. And it was soup to nuts, really. It was an and then, in E.M. Forster's Naked Worm of Time. And I was dissatisfied. I felt, I didn't want to insert myself into it, but I did want to insert some reflection. I'm trying not to say reflexive because that's such a used up kind of term now, but I wanted to not destabilize, because I'm absolutely adamant I don't fictionalize at all. There's nothing in the biography that isn't fact. I mean, there may be speculation and I'm questioning, but I kind of show that I'm questioning. I don't want anything to be invented, but I guess maybe it's because poetry is always three-dimensional, and I remain willy-nilly a poet. That sense of, when a poem shows something, it's terrible definition of poem. At the same time, it also shows you why it's showing it at some level, whether it's in context or tone or, and
or also showing you what it's not showing you, right? There's
absolutely.
Right.
And yes, and that's true too. I also wanted to acknowledge the partial nature of biography, that apart from anything else, one is commissioned for a certain length of book, that's great. And it's a great hospitable length for a reader. But of course, you could go into much more detail. You keep having to take things out because I ought to put that in because it's forensic and it ties it down. No, we haven't got space. That's got to go. I was specifically commissioned not to write a doorstep, kind of that kind of biography. And so without it being about you and your own process, you want to sort of show. Also, I want to stretch. I just want a little bit of play in the form, and then form. I just want a little bit of give. And so I was thinking, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? I mean, actually, I was agonizing about it. I was, boring my husband for several months. Oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then I sort of thought I would really, really love marginalia. And then I thought, no, that's not quite it, because marginalia, not only would it fail the production practicality test? I mean, no publisher's going to pay for that. But also, that would be very, just like being a kind of little interlocutor. And I think you could let yourself off rather easily. Joined up thought is much more difficult, isn't it, than the telling phrase. And then I thought, yes, no, but it's frames, isn't it? Because that's what I'm doing. I'm placing her in a hall of mirrors beyond her poetry. Okay, let's talk about that. And I am still very interested in that because, one isn't one absolutely fascinated by people, but also fascinated by the nature of the relationship. And it's also, I guess I resorted to the visual, the idea of the frames. That visual is a visual metaphor, isn't it? Even though obviously we talk about a framing device, we use that visual metaphor in literary talk, don't we? But I'm quite visual, and I do look at a lot of art, and but I'm absolutely not an art historian of any kind at all. But I mean, I do look at a lot, and I have a little visual obsession with windows and doorways and mirrors and framing, that sense of a narrative beyond the doorway, and I'm very interested in prose, particularly like that.
It seems to me that one of the things you achieve by doing this is she is the most famous poet on the continent at the time of her death. And so on some level, you were talking about celebrity and celebrity making, which then she is sort of falls off the radar of many people. And the question is then how to restore her to her rightful place. And it occurred to me that I was thinking that on the one hand, you have Wordsworth writing the Prelude. So that's the growth of a poet's mind. On this side of the Atlantic, you have Whitman writing Song of Myself, which is another growth of the poet's mind, or Bildungsroman, if you will. And in between the two, you have Barrett Browning, who is able to write in almost a colloquial iambic pentameter, what Frost might call loose iambics.
Absolutely.
It's not pitched as high as Wordsworth. It's not nearly as loose as what Whitman does, but you can see how that leads to what Browning does, and then Browning leads to a poet, let's say, like Constantine Cavafy, who's taking from those monologues. So there, to restore her to her rightful place is to recognize how revolutionary she was, not just in her politics, but in her poetics.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, she was a kind of great demystifier. I mean, I think that it is interesting and thorough, that it's thoroughgoing, that it's both thematic and, as you say, it's in her poetics, that she has this lovely, real loosening up of pentameter. I mean, it's often not really iambic at all, is it? You know, and which is funny because she was so obsessed with, it really was kind of a byway, it really slowed down her development. I think her early obsession with Greek prosody and, the great controversies about scansion and an absolute meticulousness about scansion. You might have expected her own verse would be overburdened with, a kind of deadening, exact, metronomic form. But no, she obviously understood poetic language as intimate. And I think maybe that partly came from the fact it was always hearth and home, that her first poems were encouraged by her family. She was the family's poet laureate, and she's writing poems to be read by people she knows. It's an intimate address right from the outset, and she sort of never outgrows that. And perhaps also because she had this tremendous ill health, she had respiratory illness, and probably something that was a kind of awful post-viral syndrome from when she was 15. And so she spent months and years in lockdown, actually. And so quite apart from class and gender, which would have kept her away from most literary salons and so on anyway, for all those formative decades, she's really doing it on her own. And she's doing it with her sister in the room and writing to her brother. And although she's getting gradually, particularly in her mid-30s onwards, she's getting published in the best places, she's still not actually meeting those editors. So it remains a sort of in the room, in the domestic environment sort of a thing. I mean, of course, people didn't do readings in the same way then. Poets didn't actually so much. I mean, obviously Charles Dickens did, so writers did, but, it's not like the poet's life now, which is very outside your room. But yeah, I think that flexibility and that intimacy and that abjuring of the big abstract, perhaps in the wrong hands, empty nouns, truth, beauty. I mean, of course, these are actually the most laden things, but they're also, it's much easier to say beauty than to say what is beautiful, she did. She shifted us. She's really very modern, I think. I mean, I think Aurora Leigh is really quite a modern read.
Yeah, well, that's
quite Asian, isn't it?
For me to go back to it after all these years and the kind of encrusted view I had of her from my own professors a long time ago who basically couldn't stand her, male professors, I'll say. But it's not a surprise to think that she would be such an inspiration to Emily Dickinson, who also is that outsider, but whose work is actually central to the society, even if in Dickinson's case, it's going to take another 50 years before people will start to be reading her in the way that Barrett Browning achieved in her own lifetime.
Yes, absolutely. And in a sense, also, they are both of that generation where all women artists were outsider artists because they didn't have a university education. They didn't have a, an education. I mean, Elizabeth sat in on her brother's tutor's lessons until the brothers went away to school, and then she was on her own from sort of 13. She's an autodidact. So, okay, she has her father's country gentleman's library. She has her mother guiding her to read Mary Wollstonecraft. She's not without resources, and she finds family friends, and like water finding its level, she finds mentors and so on. But they are, the women like Emily Dickinson, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, are having to find, they are refreshing the springs because they have to. And so there is a kind of, I mean, like Blake, in a sense, a slight, someone else who didn't go to university or, to school, really. There is a kind of, not a naivety, but it's something that's actually very charged and potent in the, and doesn't stray so far from the hymnal and those kinds of forms that are demotic.
Exactly. That's demotic is the key to reading Aurora Leigh, I think. Going back to it, under the spell of Two-Way Mirror, I thought, oh my God, how have I missed this all these years? Nine books which you can read in a different way in Fiona Sampson's wonderful biography. I think we've come to the end of our time here, and so before I turn it back to John, I wonder if do you have any last thoughts you want to leave us with? Also, to remind the audience, the book is available at Prairie Lights Bookstore. Feel free to go in; they will deliver to your house if you're here in Iowa City. But it's available on the bookshelves and by mail too.
Fantastic, thank you. I realise if I hold up the copy, I've been reading, this is the British edition, so it's not actually the book that's in Prairie Lights, which is much classier looking. Yeah, beautiful. And that's the Rossetti picture, of course, that's the Rossetti engraving.
It's, well, I have to say also the thought that came to mind, I'm glad you began with the photograph, because on this side of the Atlantic, Whitman was possibly the most photographed individual in North America in the 19th century, and he was acutely aware of the role that would play in his own image as the great gray-bearded bard. So.
And also, clearly, he loved it, didn't he? I mean, you can see in those photos, he absolutely loved being photographed. Whereas Elizabeth was camera shy and absolutely hated it. There are some really touching, awful photos when she's, not only does she look really ill, but she just doesn't know where to put herself, how much she hates being photographed. I mean, very touching. I wanted to put my hand into time and rescue her,
There's the negative of the Whitman exuberance in the photographs.
Yes.
Well, it's a fantastic book, and I'm so grateful to you for spending some time with us today, Fiona. And I see John is there, so I'll turn it back to you, John. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you both. It was delightful to hear the two of you talk and to bring the prose to life so wonderfully. So thank you to Fiona Sampson. Thank you to Christopher Merrill for moderating today. As Chris had mentioned, the book is available at Prairie Lights. And for those who are not here in Iowa City, prairielights.com also will take care of your needs. For those who would like to revisit this, or if you'd like to share it with others, a video of today's presentation will be available at the Book Festival website, which is iowacitybookfestival.org. We will have that up early next week. So thank you to those who joined us today and those who will be joining us in the future. And thanks again to Fiona and Christopher. It was a wonderful afternoon to spend with you. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks so much, Chris.
Right.
Fiona.
Bye.
Be well.
Take care.